Hello, and welcome to Home and Away, a session where we will discuss the latest short fiction by two brilliant Caribbean authors, both women. I'll jump straight into introducing them to you. Elizabeth Walcott-Hackshaw was born in Trinidad, and she's a professor of French literature and creative writing at the University of the West Indies. She has co-edited several academic works, but today will be concerned mostly with her creative writing. So her first collection of short stories, Four Taxis Facing North, was published in 2007 and was named one of the best works of 2007 by the Caribbean Review of Books. Her first novel, Mrs. B, was published by People Tree Press in 2014. Mrs. B was shortlisted for the Best Book Fiction in the Guyana Prize for Literature Awards of 2014. Her short stories have been widely translated and anthologized, and she presently lives in Santa Cruz Valley in Trinidad with her family. And today we'll be discussing her second short fiction collection, Stick No Bills. Our second writer is Zalika Reid-Benta, who is a Toronto-based writer, and her debut short story collection, Frying Plantain, which we'll be discussing today, won the 23rd annual Danuta Gleed Literary Award and the 2020 Kobo Emerging Writer Prize in Literary Fiction. The collection is currently longlisted for the Toronto Book Awards, and it was shortlisted for the 2020 Trillium Book Award, and as well as longlisted for the 2019 Scotiabank Giller Prize. Zalika is also the winner of the 2019 By Blacks People's Choice Awards for Best Author, and she's currently working on a young adult fiction novel, drawing inspiration from Jamaican folklore. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
How you all feel today?
Good, very good.
Same, yeah, very good, very excited.
So we're gonna jump straight into your reading from your collections. Zalika, I'd like you to go first and just, whet the audience's appetite with some of your great collections, Frying Plantain.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm reading from the second short story called Snow Day. I'm starting a little bit within the story. So basically my main character, Kara, she and her friends leave school during a snow day. Kara's not supposed to. And it's basically just about their journey outside of school. Our school was right at Vaughan and Oakwood, hidden in one of the residential pockets in the center of the area where the Caribbean and Europe converged. Once you left the playground, you could turn right toward downtown and head to Little Italy on St. Clair West, but we were turning left up toward Eglinton West and Marley, Island Town. The walk in either direction was mixed with both groups though. Bungalow windows boasted the colorful banners of the island flags, red, yellow, and green for Guyana, black, yellow, and green for Jamaica. Nonas and nonos crowded every other porch, teetering on rocking chairs, drinking beer or brioche noto, their pit bulls snarling in the backyard. I can't get my hood to stay on, said Jordan, bunching up her jacket at the neck so the snow wouldn't get through the gap and melt on her chest. White girls can get their hair wet, said Rochelle. Stop fronting like you need your hood. The rest of us laughed and Jordan gave us the finger. She was mixed. Her mother was Black Guyanese and her father was Canadian. 7th generation Canadian too, not Italian Canadian or Portuguese or anything. She'd come out a light milky brown, almost beige, with a small pointed nose, hazel eyes, and hair that was short and auburn and kind of curly, but mostly straight. The year before, she'd done a home spray tan to make herself darker, but ended up making herself orange instead. I was the only one who knew that. I don't know if it was because I didn't go to school with everyone yet, or because she knew I was too nice to say anything to anyone, but she told the others she couldn't go to school because of the flu. The snow was up to our shins now, and the wind had started slanting its fall, blowing it in our direction, so that snowflakes pelted into our eyes and stuck our eyelashes together. I nuzzled my nose against my scarf and trudged forward. Some of the boys in our grade had decided to stay in the playground, whipping snowballs at each other, their screams and laughter too stubborn to be drowned out by the wind. "Let's get fries from New Orleans Donuts," said Ashani. "I'm starving." "It's too cold to walk around. We can order pizza at my place," said Rochelle. "With what money? You've got like $2 to your name," said Jordan. "That's $2 more than you. And anyway, my mom left me money for an emergency. We're good." "But I feel for fries," said Ashani. No one had said anything about stopping anywhere. I turned to them but tried to keep my face buried in my hood, more as a way to hide my panicked expression than to shield myself from the cold. "Can't we just go to Shell's house? That's what we said we'd do." "If you're gonna be this way, you should just go back to school," said Anita. "Well, I actually don't care where we go," said Rochelle, "as long as we go Vaughan Way." "What's so special about Vaughan Way?" said Jordan. "You always want to walk that way." "I just like it," said Rochelle. "Yeah, but why?" The high school was on Vaughan Road, and Rochelle was seeing a guy who went there, Chris Richardson, grade 10. Every girl knew Chris, every mother too. He never kept himself out of trouble, trespassing, taking buildings, mouthing off to cops who spot checked him and his crew at the park or in front of the McDonald's or by the bus stop. But he was always quick to carry your mother's grocery bags to the door or help your grandmother find a seat in church. He did it all with sly silences and toothy smiles, and if you were lucky, a wink behind your mother's back. Be careful of boys like him, they tell us. The day Chris and Rochelle first said hey to each other, we were at Vaughan Road Academy for a tour, trying to see if that was the school we wanted to spend the next 4 years at, me pretending like I had a say in where I ended up. He'd stopped her in the hallway, took her by the hand and guided her to him, putting his hands around her waist as she stood in the space between his spread out legs. It was a move she was used to. Rochelle had that really fair rose brown complexion, the kind of red skin and shapely heaviness that made cars slow down and girls up down, and she'd been dealing with hungry-eyed boys since she was 10. While they were talking, I pretended to flip through the notes my mother had told me to write down, far enough behind Rochelle that I wasn't interrupting, but close enough that if she wanted out, she could just turn to me and we'd walk away together, our arms linked. Chris had thought she was a transfer student, a sophomore like him, and only when he took down her number did Rochelle tell him she'd just turned 14 and was in grade 8. First he got quiet, then he left without even saying bye. But later on that night, she called me and said he'd rung her up and they just finished a 3-hour conversation. "Just don't tell anyone," she said. "It's a secret, okay?" Sometimes we both pictured the lick she'd get if her mom ever found out about Chris. And Rochelle's mom didn't play around, she used the belt. My mother didn't like to use objects. She always said her hands were sharp enough. I tried to imagine keeping something like a boy from her, if a boy ever showed any interest in me, and I felt my body turn in on itself. Even the backs of my eyeballs throbbed as if they'd grown strained from searching for her open palmed hand. It was how I felt when I let myself think that the storefront boys were smirking at me. The panic would creep up on my body like a slow moving fever. And then for a brief moment, I'd feel glad I wasn't sexy enough to keep a secret like Rochelle's.
Thank you, Zalika. Elizabeth, we'll go to your reading from Stick No Bills, which is,
Okay.
I believe, your second short story collection.
Great, thank you. The collection is a little different to what I normally do. It's part of it is just the regular short stories, and then another part of it, a lot of like very short pieces. So I'm just going to read from a couple of the short pieces today. The first one is called Saturday Mornings on the Hill. I like to run. I call myself a runner, and this one is sort of inspired by that. And Zalika, thank you so much. I enjoyed your story very much.
Thank you.
Saturday Mornings on the Hill. Most Saturday mornings, I run up that hill, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends who have become bright lights in my life. When I am alone, the hill is always harder, but there is more space for thoughts. Sometimes too many come at once and I lose my stride, my rhythm. Thoughts can do that, affect breathing, running. Like life, it's all about the breath. On Saturday mornings, the hill is crowded with all types, runners, walkers, riders, children in prams, groups, loners, couples, all trying to get to the top. There are luxurious homes tucked into the hillside and trees shade us from much of the climb. Morning, we say, or simply nod to acknowledge a fellow climber. With each bend, especially on a sunny morning, the savanna down below glistens, and even the charmless buildings of that charmless capital with its dirty harbor shine. The other morning, running alone, I saw someone I knew. She smiled in her wide, usual, lovely way. She wore a wide-rimmed black hat to protect her pale skin from the sun. In her black t-shirt and long, loose black pants, she stood out as she walked past a group in fluorescent gym wear. The Hill has no dress code. We all belong and are free to wear whatever we like. No one really cares. My friend was heading up as I was going down, having already run to the top, performed my ritual at the top of the hill of touching the spot on our magic tree, always taking a moment to look at the pines along the ridge on the next hill. The pines, like soldiers, stand in a line, protecting the valleys below. At the top of the hill, when I'm with my friends, after we touch the trunk, we always congratulate each other, as though it were our first time to get to the top, even though it's been many years since we started to spend Saturday mornings together. They don't know that these days, when I get to the top, I always think of you. My friend in the wide black hat had recently lost her husband. I used to see them out together. They were always together. Black is our color of mourning. The words mourning and mourning, their sound is so unfairly similar. On the way down, I pass others I know. This one has just lost a brother, this one a mother. My friend is not alone. We all share in some loss and these glorious Saturday mornings on the hill. I'll just read another one from the collection. This is the last story, and I actually dedicated it to Jeremy Pointing, who's the editor, as you all know, of People Tree. Because when I finished the collection, he said I needed one more story. I didn't think I needed another story, but Jeremy thought I did. And then I wrote this one, and I'm glad he made me write it. I hope you're glad he made me write it too. It's called Lost and Found. In order to help him, I had to enter his dream. He was sitting, looking out at the bay from his chair, his eyes the color of sea, fixed on some spot that only he could see. For a moment, we were all there with him, children and grandchildren, standing behind him for a grand family portrait. But he didn't seem to notice. He was looking for her. The battle, he said, was not with the loss, but with the forgetting. That is the fear we carry with us. Another scene. We are all around the table in the valley, laughing and arguing ideas to the death. This time she is there, and so is he, younger versions of themselves. The bougainvillea, purple, orange, fuchsia are overgrown. The table has a long crack down the center like a broken spine. It balances on 3 legs, the 4th fractured like an injured dog. We act as though we will be sitting at that round table in our glistening valley forever. So we don't see it coming, too careless with our happiness. And soon the clans claim it all, house, chair, beds, and the sound of our voices. What fades first? What do you lose first? Forgetting is the fear we carry with us. Tap, tap, tapping as we have breakfast, playing your music on an imaginary keyboard. She is making scrambled eggs. We sit quietly and wait. You start a sentence and then you leave us. She completes it for you, fills in the space you left while you sit tap, tap, tap. She measures sugar for your coffee, you measure limes. We wait and eventually you come back. We knew you would follow her, only a matter of time. The loss spread through you like a cancer. Your words worked magic, but only for a time. Even your pyramid gods couldn't bring her back. What fades first is what we fear most. The little things we want to hold on to. Battles at the breakfast table, pecks on the cheeks, the hellos and goodbyes, healing and losing, finding peace in forgetting. Misty, cool, damp dewgrass, sun coming up over the hill, my perfect morning. No longer running away, now I go towards it. Here and not here. I have stopped looking, call off the search, sit at the table in that other valley with other voices, fresh and green like my morning, found. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
You're welcome.
Tell me something about that story that you just read. Was it by any chance inspired by the relationship between your parents?
Yeah, I mean, this last collection, I lost two parents, one in 2014 and one in 2017. So this had to be one of the hardest collections I ever worked on. So yes, it was inspired. It's very autobiographical because we used to sit at that table in my mother's house in the valley. So yeah, a lot of this collection comes very much, I mean, in the first part, like I said, there's stories that, come to me like how stories normally come. But in the last part of it, when I lost both of them within that time frame, it was unavoidable. It was right in front of me. So instead of running from it, I tried to see if I could get it out.
Yes, I picked up on it because, well, for our viewers, for anyone who doesn't know, Elizabeth is actually one of the daughters of great poet laureate Desirée Walcott. So I picked up on it because I remember having a conversation, very casual conversation with your sister. And she talks about how your dad would always kind of tap, tap, tap when he was doing his poetry, when he would kind of tap the rhythms out, of the poems as he was composing them in his head. And so when I read that, I was like, maybe you're talking about him in this. That kind of leads me to another question. So like, I'm going to get to you shortly. I don't want to leave you out, but just to kind of continue this train of thought, Elizabeth. A lot of you talked about the fact that a lot of these stories came out of the deaths of their parents. And there's really a sense of grief in a lot of these stories, in the vignettes that you talked about, as well as these stories themselves. They are linked by grief, by waiting to lose someone, waiting to lose something, waiting to the process of losing, as well as actually dealing with the aftermath of loss. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that and how that has permeated even the stories that are not inspired by autobiographical events. Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of it is about loss, but the thing is, I think what's interesting is the way in which Jeremy helped me shape the collection. It was really quite useful because some of the stories predate having lost my parents, so those kind of come at the beginning, and then I kind of go through a process of I don't know, dealing with illness and all sorts of things, and then I come to the end. And I don't want people to think it's a totally depressing collection. There are moments of light.
Yeah, definitely.
But the last story, that's why I read it, and Lost and Found, it's supposed to take you through that trajectory of pain and loss, which I think is good to be acknowledged, but also about not forgetting. And the thing about not forgetting is that it's both painful and I think necessary, because the pain makes you remember. So in a strange way, you have to work with both the pain of feeling that loss all the time, which helps you to remember, which I think is good. So I guess Lost and Found kind of deals with that. You're dealing with a pain, but also the importance of that pain. And then the second valley that I talk about is where I live now. I mean, in Santa Cruz. I've lived there for a long time. I live next to my sister. She has kids, I have kids. So it's a valley that I grew up in, and now I'm in the Santa Cruz Valley, which I love. So that's the Found. There's another valley. There's a lovely, to me, an arc to it. So yeah, so that's why I like that Found, that sense of finding something else to move forward.
I got you. It's not a depressing book. I want to make that clear.
Thank you.
Even though grief is definitely a threat, it is not a depressing book at all. And there are stories where there's a lovely, it's not a happy ending, but there's a lovely uptick at the end of them. There's always hope. There's always a looking forward, as you mentioned. And I really do like that about the collection.
Thank you.
Zalika, Frying Plantain was a excellent read. I actually, you read stuff and collections, you put them down. This I sat down and I read in a 2-hour split. I don't know if I just didn't have the time. My daughter was leaving me alone. I don't know what was happening, but I read it straight through. And I think one of the things that kind of helped to compel that was that even though it's a short story collection, your stories follow one narrator from young girl to nearly university student, I think. But it isn't what the reader would expect. It's not chronological, generally speaking, you know? Did you know that you wanted to kind of experiment with that kind of texture, that kind of almost novelesque type treatment when you started?
Yeah, so it's actually quite funny because when I first started writing the collection, I thought I was writing a novel. So I wrote it, and my workshop and my instructors were like, so you just wrote a story. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'll just like try to write another chapter. And then I wrote another story, and they're like, so that's a story, you're writing stories. You're basically just writing stories. And I was like, okay, I'm just, because that became, or that was natural to me, I was like, well, if I'm writing stories and that's the form that it's taking, then I guess I'm just gonna write stories. And then later on, you know, because one thing you get with collections a lot is, why don't you just make it a novel, especially if it is one narrator or one, or you follow the same characters. And I didn't want to turn it into a novel because, like you said, it is sort of chronological, but it's not chronological. And I didn't want to fill in spaces. Like if Kara is, you know, at one school and then she goes to the other school, I didn't want to write about how she got to that school. I just wanted to be in that moment. So I really wanted to write snapshots or moments of Kara's life. And so it was easier to do that in a short story collection as opposed to just a novel where you have those linkages and things that you need to kind of write out.
Okay, so at the end of it, the last story is, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it is a beautiful ending, and it is a resolve in a sense. A lot of these stories kind of deal with your protagonist's relationships with her mother and with her grandmother, who are both from Jamaica. Did you write that story last? Did you know that that was going to be the ending? How did that story come to be? Because I'm really interested in that story in particular.
That was actually the first story of the collection that I wrote.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, because I think that story has a lot of the themes that are throughout the collection. And so I think that writing that story first was just kind of me being like, this is what my book is going to be about. You know, because you have the mother character, you have the grandmother character, you have Kara's friends, you have the setting of Little Jamaica in Toronto. You have just, you know, Kara as a child, you have Kara as a teenager. So basically like everything that I get into more detail with individual stories, it's all in that one story. So I think that was just kind of me being like, this is what I'm doing. And for the longest time, that story was actually in the middle of my collection as a sort of just the centerpiece, because I thought it was the centerpiece of my book. And then it wasn't actually until I talked to my agent where she was just kind of like, there's a very elegiac quality to it. There's a very resolved quality to it. I feel like you should end it that way. You shouldn't put it in the middle, and that made like complete sense to me. So I kind of just moved it to the end, closer to when it got a publisher.
That's excellent. It just goes to show how much, as much as you are the author, other people have their hands in your books, in your collections, and make them what they are when they go out into the world, you know? I mean, absolutely. Elizabeth talks about Jeremy being her editor, and I think it's so important for people who are not published to remember that books are not, I mean, they are your babies, but there are other people that help you birth them, you know? That's a really interesting story. Elizabeth, your collection as well, the middle section, Stick No Bills, about 6 stories. They share a narrator in common as well. Who kind of morphs from a very young girl's voice into an adult kind of looking back at the same situation that the young girl talked about. And I thought that was interesting as well. And then you referenced, you talk about the title of the collection, obviously, Stick No Bills, and you referenced 4 Taxis Facing North as another kind of sign that the young girl would have seen.
Mhm.
Why that reference? You know, I saw it and I was like, that's interesting. Why kind of make reference to that first collection like that?
Well, I don't know why, but I really have been always fascinated with signs. So I do remember seeing the Stick No Bill sign growing up. I don't know if you remember it on the Ice Factory.
I do.
And it's still there.
And
Stick
other
No
places
Bill.
as well.
Yeah, but I just associated with that. I mean, that point of departure came from something when I was young, and I did used to go in there with my mother, and then it kind of took off, as you said, into a whole, new family that kind of came together in my head. The reference to the four taxis is just like a sleight of hand, just a little bit of fun to link it to the past collection, because I have friends who write and tell me that it's not four taxis, it's five. Obviously, the sign says five taxis facing north. It was a sign next to the Queen's Park Hotel. I don't know if you remember, near to the Savannah. I changed it to four because it was like an internal reference to like a family, etc. So it's really just a sleight of hand linking the collections together. Nothing too deep or profound, really, about it. Just a kind of link,
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I was hoping for more there, but no problem.
I'm so sorry to disappoint.
That's completely fine. I'm fine. Too much.
Yeah.
Trying to find too profound things in
But maybe you could tell me
what they are.
Tell me what to say next time, so I can sound a little more erudite about it.
No. We are fine. We're okay.
Yeah.
So, ladies, both collections are really rooted in Caribbean identity. Even though Zalika is set in Canada, and well, Elizabeth, yours is in the Caribbean. It jumps between Trinidad and St. Lucia. And I wanted you all to kind of talk about some of the ways that you consciously grappled with the idea of Caribbean identity, the Caribbean identity of your narrators in the collections.
Well, for me, it was interesting just because it's from the perspective of a Canadian girl. And so yeah, it was just kind of this thing that when I was growing up in the schools that I was going to, and the friends that I had, you didn't want to be Canadian. There was just something about being Canadian. You just did not want to do it. You wanted to rep the islands that your parents or your grandparents were from. And so we had our own ideas of what it meant to be of those countries. And a lot of us had gone back and forth between Canada and Jamaica or Trinidad or Guyana or Barbados or Grenada. But obviously we weren't of those countries. So I wanted to kind of talk about that identity there, and how in Toronto, you can kind of have this third culture thing where your parents and your home space is very like they bring their culture, they bring their identity from home there. And then you have this Canadian, or specifically Toronto identity at school, and how they can kind of mesh and become this other diasporic thing. And so that is what I wanted to kind of explore, just like what it would be like for a second or third generation Jamaican-Canadian girl in a specific time period at a specific time, because Toronto's a little bit different now, especially like, with Drake or with the Raptors and things like that. There's more of like a Toronto pride. But when this is taking place, that wasn't quite a thing yet. It was just more like, you're proud because you were from, or your family was from Jamaica, or you were proud because your family was from wherever in the Caribbean. So I just wanted to explore that, and I definitely wanted to make it clear that it's like a specific experience. I wasn't trying to talk or speak for every Black girl in Toronto or every Jamaican Canadian or for Jamaica. It was just like, this is how she specifically experiences identity in this collection.
And it does feel very unique and individual, because she's going through a kind of double identity crisis, in that, there's the wider sense of being an immigrant or child of immigrants in Canada. And then there's the sense that she's not even really accepted by her group because she's not Caribbean enough,
Yeah, there's like this whole idea of whose accent is better and who can say certain slang and who can say certain this, and like if you really know what certain things mean. And yeah, so I really wanted to play with that. And I also wanted to play with the idea that in her community she may not be accepted, but if she goes out of her community and she puts on this performance, they think that it's the most genuine thing. So she kind of becomes a spokesperson, even though she's not really a spokesperson. So yeah, I just thought that, the idea of identity in that sense was really interesting, and the conflicts of that. And also there's like a lot of joy in that too, I think I probably explore the joy of the identity mostly through food. And so that was, it was really fun for me to write those segments. And I didn't even realize that I did that until someone pointed it out to me. She's like, do you realize that like every time something great happens, like Jamaican food is involved? And I was like, oh, no, I did not notice that. But after she pointed that out, it kind of became something that I intentionally did. So yeah, it was just, those parts are also really, really fun.
Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to kind of deal with that same topic, but for your collection.
I was just listening. I mean, that is such a fantastic answer, because I do, just switching hats a little bit. Of course, at the university, we look at Caribbean women writers, and we also talk about writers outside of the Caribbean and trying to deal with sort of negotiating that space of, being, living in, well, we do Dantica, for example, a Haitian identity, then you're in New York or you're in Brooklyn or you're in Miami. And just the way in which you responded to that, I wish I could have taped it from my class, because it really speaks to that. In terms of what I'm doing, I just find the Caribbean and even the Trinidadian identity such a complex. I think it would take generations to try and figure out what that identity actually is. So I find it a gold mine. I mean, I find this small place, and my dad being St. Lucia, and my brother is born in Jamaica. I mean, we're very Caribbean. My grandmother, one is from Grenada. I mean, a very Caribbean family. So I've always found it, just even trying to understand small groups. And I like what you said, Zalika, it's not representative of the entire group. It can't be. You're speaking about a particular character from a particular location from, Trinidad is a small place, but it's huge in terms of different identities and its pluralities and issues and conflicts. So I think, I'm just touching, a very, very small part of it. And I think it's not even Caribbean, it's a part of Trinidad that I may be looking at a particular group, etc. So I actually think that there is so much more to write about it, and from your perspective outside, looking in, moving back and forth, I think it's fascinating. And I think that's why we have so many writers, and it's such a gold mine, of things to still discover, because it's not static, it's dynamic, and we keep changing. And it's, so to say it's an identity, I don't think, I think it's something that keeps changing all the time. So it's not one identity. We can't say a Caribbean identity. I think we can say, this is where we are now today, but in 5 years from now, we don't know what that is going to mean exactly. So I find it actually very exciting.
I understand what you mean. And I do agree with you in terms of the sense of Caribbean identities rather than one collective identity. We are not at all at any point in time one thing, even from one island,
even from within an island.
From one island, there's so many different identities that happen within that island. I mean, as small as Trinidad is to as large as Jamaica is, people in Jamaica would say, well, no, I'm from Portmore, and Portmore has this particular identity. People from Sando are like, well, South people different from North people, and so I totally understand where you're going with that. I think we're going to jump into some questions from our online audience. Yeah. So the first one is from Ira Mathur via Facebook. And she says there are two ideas of short stories that do the rounds in the literary world. The one is that short stories are hard to sell. And the other is that they are harder to write than a novel. And of course, poetry is said to be the hardest to write as well, as you have so few words to play with. So I'm gonna let you guys deal with the short story part. She kind of chickened the poetry part for me because I'm a poet. And I'll add my thoughts in a little bit afterward. But I'd really love to hear what you all think about them being, short story collections being hard to sell and harder to write than a novel.
Well, I'm writing a novel now, and I actually find that much harder than writing short stories. Maybe that's just also because for the past 10 years, I've been writing short stories, but I can't get used to the idea of the length of a novel, because the thing with the short story, and it was a maddening process writing the stories for Frying Plantain, also just because I'm a perfectionist writer. So if I didn't like a sentence, I wasn't going to continue on. I had to make sure that sentence was perfect in my mind. So that meant that it could be like 6 months to finish a story. But because every single word in a short story should mean something, I have that in my head because you need to get your point across in a certain amount of pages. The fact that I have a freedom of the novel where you can kind of meander a little bit, that's something that I'm still not used to. And I find that very difficult. I find that very difficult to just like let myself go without it becoming word vomit. So it's kind of the opposite for me, where I'm just like, I don't know, this is like a lot of pressure to just like write. In terms of harder to sell, that's definitely something that I heard. That's also why I was like, are you sure you don't want to make it a novel? So I got a lot of rejections just because it wasn't a novel. But my publisher, Nancy, House of Nancy, and the imprint, Astoria, which actually deals with short story collections, picked it up, and I think it's going okay. So, that's, yeah. There's also this idea, at least, that short stories are kind of coming back, that people are writing them more and more, and kind of combating this idea that nobody reads short stories. That's the other thing that you hear, like nobody reads short stories, and I don't think that's true. So.
I don't think it's true either. And it sounds like you might have a couple poems in you, Zalika, since you're so careful about your word choices, you understand? Because, I mean, obviously, poetry, you have to be extremely meticulous. But sorry, Elizabeth, you were going to answer as well.
I think I agree that I find short stories, they're difficult to write, but they're easier for me to write. I actually find novels quite difficult because I find you need a sustained period to write a novel. I mean, I think it's hard to stop a novel and to go back because sometimes you lose the voice. I remember when I was working on Mrs. B, there was one character that I thought, this is who I'm writing about. Then I left and came back. Then I realized, no, this is not who I'm writing about anymore, because you need that time. You need to keep that voice going. If you have a lot of characters, it's almost maddening because you have to make sure that you have all of these people in your head and that they're not, mirroring each other. They're distinct. So I have to agree with you. I actually think the novel is harder, at least for me. This is not to say that short stories, some come out easily and some are more difficult, but I find a novel I gained tremendous respect for novelists when I finished Mrs. B. I mean, tremendous, because it's incredible. Poets, on the other hand, I mean, I have my opinion of poets, but I'll keep that to myself. I think they're a different group altogether, poets and playwrights. Because that's very difficult. So you can talk to poetry. You tell us.
Poetry. It definitely is. I feel like I lean more towards how Zalika feels, in that I am constantly cutting. And to write the amount that a novel would take, I don't know if I have it in me. I have wonderful novel ideas. I have beautiful ideas, and they always turn out into extremely short stories or they end up into a prose poem. So I would definitely, I think writing a novel would be one of the hardest things that I would do if I ever do attempt it. I've done short stories, I've done plays. All my plays are really short as well. They're like 10 minutes. So I think it really depends on the person, because there are people who have all three in them, like your dad, Elizabeth, or like, like a Kai Miller, or, we have a bunch of people who are able to, they just span, they do everything. But there are those of us who have a, genre specific feel, this is how we want to use words, this is how we want to use language, and we tend to stick to those. Yeah. I noticed in both of you guys' collections that these stories have a lot of these stories have their conflicts in relationship clashes more than an external event. Not that they don't have external event conflicts as well, but they just a lot of them was relationship clashes, whether it was a sort of an old clash that had been, was being rehashed, or if it was something new. I wanted to find out, what kind of led what were those like deliberate structural choices, or did that just come with the characters that you were trying to speak about?
Yeah.
Sure. I really like dynamics. I really like relationships. I watch a lot of movies and I watch a lot of TV, so I like seeing people interact. So I also really like dialogue, and I really like what dialogue can bring about, to the point that when I was doing this collection, people were like, okay, you have like 5 pages of dialogue and I have no idea where they are. Are they sitting? Are they standing? Like they're just talking to each other. So anything that allows me to do dialogue, I like to do. I also really like how relationships can manifest itself or themselves in interiority. So like you said, there is a lot of external clashes and external conflicts. But I feel like those shape my main character, those shape Kara, and she's a very interior character, but she's also a very private character. So they manifest in how she reacts and acts to things. And I think that I was just really interested in that cause and effect, where it's just like, okay, so she witnesses, for instance, in one of my stories, there's a neighbor, a couple, and they have like these very violent arguments, and she listens to them, and she's trying to figure out if these arguments are like, they're toxic, but she also finds them a bit romantic because she's also like 14, and you have this kind of warped idea of what passion is at that age. And so her trying to enact that, or her trying to like work that out by listening to those two people, like that kind of thing was what I found really interesting and really fun to write. So that's how that sort of happened. I think it's just because I have a really great interest in dynamics and relationships.
Yeah. What can I say for mine? I think for me, what I find interesting is a lot of what people actually say is not actually what they're thinking. So I always find like there tends to be that little gap. I mean, even if you have a conflict, sometimes the words that are actually uttered have nothing to do with the actual thought of what the person actually wanted to say. So I guess that kind of gap in between, I have one story where 2 friends are talking, and what one friend is thinking, and there's a lot of jealousy going on, and one friend is almost totally unaware of how jealous the other friend is of her, but the other one is seething with this jealousy, but what's coming out of her mouth has nothing to do with the feelings. Those kind of dynamics I find interesting in human nature, this sort of fragmentation between thought and words, would actually come out, because a lot of it to me is not direct. And then I like internal battles, sort of like battles that you kind of have, with yourself, things actions that you would like to do, but you're prevented for all sorts of insecurities and all those things. So for me, a lot of it is internal battles, but also when there is dialogue, I'm very interested in what is not said as opposed to what is actually uttered, if you know what I mean. It's the silence of what somebody holds back, what they really want to say, and what is uttered. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, actually, when I came up with that question, that's exactly that story with the jealousy.
Yeah.
That story is exactly what I was thinking about, because it's so on the surface so calm, and it's so
Vicious.
just bitter underneath. She is so bitter, and it just ends so calmly, and I'm like, oh my god, this woman is so toxic. This is can be your friend. This is not the kind of friend that you want to have in your life.
No.
If that's what, and so the fact that both your characters have a lot of internal dialogue. They have a lot of the conflicts are sometimes they're internal. They're just conflicts within themselves, and nothing is happening on the outside. I found that really interesting, and it's not untraditional in terms of short stories, because people have been doing it for a while, but not a lot of. It's something that I feel it tends to be something that women writers latch onto a lot. A lot of the internal thoughts, what is happening inside, what is the internal conflict, rather than what is happening on the outside. I think we have one more question. Sorry, you wanted to say something, Elizabeth?
No, yes, I wanted to add, yeah, you're right. A lot of women writers, I mean, one of my favorite writers is a Haitian writer called Yannick Laons. I don't know if you know of her. But,
yes.
Yeah, I mean, she's excellent. And a lot of her, the same thing. I love her stories for that. Very much, not much is going on the outside, but on the inside, I mean, there's so many battles and wars being fought, you know, and she does that well. Dantika is another one who does that really,
yes.
Yeah, you know, really well. You know, the kind of subtlety that comes, the kind of restraint that she can have, you know, in her writing, where these battles are going on, but what is actually uttered doesn't necessarily reflect the internal war that is taking place. And that that tension I find very interesting in writers.
Yes, I do as well. One more question from the audience. So we have a question from Nicholas Lachlan via YouTube. So Elizabeth, you spoke about the role of remembering in Stick No Bills. And he wants to know from both writers, how do you think fiction can deal with memory, personal or collective, in ways that maybe nonfiction doesn't? I.e., how and when does remembering become imagining, and vice versa?
For me, it's actually quite interesting, because when I first started writing Frying Plantain, I didn't base it in Toronto. I wrote a book of the collection when I was in New York. So it was just kind of this amorphous city that could kind of be anywhere. And people were kind of like, I don't really know where this is. And I was just like, I don't know, I just want to have like this sort of universal appeal, whatever I thought that meant at the time. But every time I came back home, Toronto was changing. Toronto was changing very fast. All of the landmarks that I grew up with were being destroyed and turned into condos, and especially Eglinton Western Marley, or Eglinton West, a little Jamaican neighborhood. It's now like under total construction. It's barely recognizable. And that really hurt, just because there were so many, like I attached so many memories and so many feelings to that neighborhood. And I mean, like we have our Caribbean festival, Caravan, Kitty Carnival used to be there, and it was like all of these different things. And so I ended up putting that Toronto in my story, and all of my different stories, where I was just kind of like, I kind of want to commemorate this place. And at least, I'm going to be honest, I don't read a lot of nonfiction. But in terms of the fictional idea, I just liked having that from the perspective of a character and her emotions attached to it, and how she views that particular space. And I found that can make things very personal, just because it's just like, yeah, this is how this character is navigating a neighborhood that I feel is no longer around. And so that's kind of where it became, and that's how kind of Toronto, and that area of Toronto became kind of like a character unto itself. And that was really interesting for me to kind of go back and do, because I did that with intention, whereas a lot of things that I did in my collection kind of came out, and then afterwards I have to edit it for intention. But going into something with the intention, like, this is what I'm going to do, that was a very different process for me, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. So in that sense, where the the place can kind of become its own character. I think that's kind of where it came.
Yeah. In my case, first I want to thank Nicholas for such an easy question. It's always so kind. But I think once you, I think with memory, and once you're trying to pull memories, I think all memories kind of end up at some point as fiction, at some point, because when you're writing, there's a process that, I mean, otherwise it would be autobiographical, right? Or it would be a biography. But once you're moving into fiction and you're drawing from memory and you're drawing from your life, then I think going back, you can never go back and get it right. I mean, my sister always jokes with me saying, well, how do you remember it this way? I remember it this way or that way. We all remember things differently. As I said, there's no real right version, although I think my version is the right version and not my sister's, but there is no correct version. But I think all memory eventually leads to some form of drawing from the imagination, because how we remember an event, there's a process of, there's a space with time. So you cannot go back exactly to that period and draw that memory back. You can remember fragments of it or bits of it, but it's like the sequence of it may have changed and your perspective would have changed. So I think fiction allows for the slides that might take place in memory and imagination. But it's very interesting because I do think about that. You know, when you draw from a particular event or take something, it has to pass through that process of imagination and time. So to me, those two filters work well for fiction, not so much for nonfiction, but I think definitely for fiction. But it's a great question. It really is, because it is something you think about, you know, when you pull from memory and remembering. Yeah.
It is, because I mean, for nonfiction and for poetry, you don't, for fiction and for poetry, you don't have to stick to exact events. I actually recently read Elizabeth Nunez's memoir, one of her memoirs, Not for Everyday Use, and she was talking about a lot of difficult things about her parents, the beauty in their relationship as well as, you know, the cracks, and that she remembers certain things that her siblings would rather she didn't remember, or they don't remember it the same way, you know, they don't remember those cracks that she remembers. And so to come out and to say that is actual memory is difficult, because if someone is always challenging it, you know, whereas in fiction, you could remember whatever you want to remember and however you want to remember it. You can portray it however it is in your mind, however your memory looks, without necessarily being challenged, because you can, you know, just say, well, it's, you know, it's a fictional it's a fictional event. We have one more question for both of you guys from the audience, and then we're going to wrap up. From Robert Huggins. I'm not sure where it came from, but he wants to know, as women, how challenging is it to write in the voice of a man?
There are hardly any men in my collection.
There are hardly any men, but there is a lovely short where your protagonist goes out with her grandfather, and yes. I thought that was well done. Yeah, you want to talk about that? Yeah,
sure. So with that, I really like interesting dynamics and interesting tensions. And so, you know, the grandfather in this particular family is the cause for a lot of tension and a lot of conflict, but he has this kind of spiritual connection to Kara, and they kind of, you know, they have this understanding of each other that she doesn't necessarily have with the other members of her family. And she doesn't like that because she doesn't like how he treats the other members of her family. So I think that at least for that case, I just wanted to portray something genuine and portray something complicated. And I didn't really think about it in terms of like, he's a man and you know, she's a girl or anything like that. It was just kind of like, here's a person who she has this connection to that she doesn't really want to have a connection to. And so I kind of just approached it from that perspective. But yeah, I don't really know if I really answered that question, but that's just kind of how, but I remember one time a man interviewed me, and he actually picked up on the different male characters and says, you write them with like actually like a lot of sympathy. And I was like, that's great, thank you. I've never heard that before, but I'm glad you think that way.
Yeah. For me, I'm a bit of a coward. There are not a lot of men in my stories. They're more populated with, I think they're more women, but the men I do have, I think Zalika has a point. You look at it more in terms of, you know, human nature. And again, you're trying to capture what would a person do, male or female, within that particular situation. But it's difficult. It's not easy to get easily into the head of the male characters. I'll be quite honest. It is a challenge. I do have some, but if you notice, they're less. They're more women than men in. And again, I go back to Dantika. She's excellent with male characters. If you look at the Jewbreaker, it's fantastic, you know. But it's a challenge, and it's a good question. It's a good question. Yeah, it is a challenge. I'll be honest. Yeah.
Okay, I do notice that you draw some of your male characters, particularly grandfathers, in a very sort of a romantic light, Elizabeth.
I do.
Very.
Oh, good.
I felt they were. Yeah,
Yeah.
I felt they were quite romantically drawn. They were. It was always with a lot of fondness, with a lot of, you know, kind of nostalgia, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they accuse a lot of Caribbean, you know, women writers of, I've seen it written of just men are either absent or they're horrible or whatever. And that has not been my experience. I mean, you meet horrible women all the time too. So I think it's not so much gender. I think it's experience. Yes, there is the absentee issue, but I do think that there's enough, there are a lot of good, you know, Caribbean men around to be included in texts that are not necessarily, you know, portrayed in a negative light, because we've seen that and I've read that, you know. That's why I find it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Agreed. Well, ladies and audience, that brings us to the end of Home and Away. We can wrap up here. Elizabeth and Zalika, I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. You guys are both brilliant writers. I've enjoyed both of your collections, and I hope that everybody gets a chance to go out and get them either on, you know, either hard copy or a soft copy, depending on, you know, where you are in the world. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And thank you.
Thank you. Yes, this was
You're a great host. Yeah,
yes.
You're a great host. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Bye.